Thud! That wasn't the sound of files dropping or a fist hitting a table. It was the dull, terrifying sound of a heavy body hitting the floor. Daniel Reyes froze in the middle of the hallway. His hand still gripped the handle of a mop, dripping with the smell of bleach. Through the thick, soundproof glass of the conference room, he saw something no low-level employee was ever supposed to see. Isabella Cruz, the most powerful CEO in the corporation, was sprawled on the expensive carpet, face down, motionless. Just 5 seconds ago, Daniel's biggest worry was how to finish his shift early to pick up his daughter, Emma, and deal with an overdue $120 electric bill. He was just a single father, a ghost in a gray uniform with Daniel stitched on his chest, someone the elites on this floor never bothered to look in the eye. But in this moment, that ghost was the only one moving. Inside the conference room, men in custom-tailored suits were backing away as if Isabella were a ticking time bomb. Cowardice was written all over their well-manicured faces. Daniel tossed the mop aside. He lunged for the conference room door. "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" The burly security guard blocked the door, holding up a hand to stop him. "She's not moving! Get out of the way!" Daniel didn't wait for an answer. He slammed his shoulder into the guard, the force of a man used to manual labor, sending the guard stumbling. The heavy wooden door flew open. The air inside was freezing. Daniel dropped to his knees beside Isabella. He turned her over. The face of the business world's Iron Lady was now gray. Her lips were blue. "Call 911! Now!" Daniel yelled. His voice echoed, out of place in the dead silence. No one moved. One of the directors took out his phone, but the camera lens was pointed at him. Daniel leaned close to her face. No breath. He pressed his fingers to her neck. "No pulse! Cardiac arrest! Damn it!" he hissed through his teeth. Daniel interlocked his hands, placing them in the center of her sternum. He put his entire body weight into it, arms straight, pushing deep. The basic first aid lessons from his construction worker days came flooding back, as clear as a survival instinct. 1, 2, 3. Breathe, please, Daniel muttered, sweat starting to bead on his forehead, dripping onto this stranger's suit jacket. He didn't see a CEO. He only saw a life slipping through his fingers. After 30 chest compressions, her chest was still motionless. Daniel didn't hesitate. He pinched her nose, tilted her chin up, and leaned down, pressing his mouth to hers to give a breath. The entire room gasped in horror. "Oh my God! Look!" a woman's voice shrieked. "He's kissing her! You pervert!" a man yelled. "Get him off her! That's sexual harassment." Daniel heard it all, but he didn't stop. He gave a second breath. Isabella's chest rose slightly, then fell. He went back to compressions. Suddenly, a rough hand grabbed his collar from behind. "I said, let go!" The security guard and 2 other employees pulled Daniel backward. He lost his balance, his head hitting the hard edge of the oak table. Thwack! The blinding pain made his vision go dark. He fell to the floor, gasping for air. But in the middle of his daze, another sound emerged. Cough! Cough! Isabella's body jolted, and she coughed violently. She took a long, ragged breath, greedily gulping for air like someone who had just surfaced from the bottom of the sea. Her eyes flew open, panicked, and vacant. Daniel lay on the floor, holding his head. From his low vantage point, he could see her chest rising and falling violently. She was alive. The conference room doors burst open again. Victor Hale, the chief financial officer, strode in. He glanced at Isabella, who was being helped up by an assistant, then looked down at Daniel as if he were a piece of trash that needed to be cleaned up. "Get this situation under control," Victor commanded, his voice cold and emotionless. He pointed at Daniel. "Get him out of here. Use the freight elevator. Don't let the press see his face." 2 security guards hauled Daniel to his feet. "But I just saved," Daniel tried to say, his head still ringing. "Shut up," the guard said, tightening his grip on Daniel's bicep and shoving him toward the door. Daniel was dragged down the hall, past his janitor's cart, which was still lying on its side. The metal doors of the elevator for trash and freight opened and swallowed him whole. The sound of the steel door slamming shut completely cut off the luxurious, fragrant world outside. In the cramped space that reeked of machine oil, Daniel leaned against the cold wall and slid to the floor. He looked at his hands, which were still trembling. His heart hammered against his ribs. He knew the rules of this game. The poor weren't allowed to touch the rich, not even to save their lives. The elevator began to descend. Daniel closed his eyes, thinking of Emma. He was probably going to lose his job today. Daniel had no idea. Just a few minutes after being dragged from that room, what he had just done would be seen in a completely different light. And the truth isn't always on the side of the poor. If you're following this story, hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the next chapters, where Daniel Reyes's fate will take a turn no one expected, and his act of kindness will be twisted into evidence to condemn him. The freight elevator doors opened, blasting Daniel's face with the cold, musty air of the B2 basement. There was no red carpet, no wood-paneled walls, just gray concrete and bare pipes running overhead. 2 security guards still flanked him as if they were escorting a criminal. They led him down the corridor and stopped in front of a small, frosted glass office that the HR department used for disciplinary issues with the manual labor staff. "Get in." "Sit still," the burly guard ordered with a jerk of his chin. Daniel walked in. The room was so quiet, he could hear the hum of the paper shredder in the corner. He sat down on a hard plastic chair, clasping his hands on his lap to hide the trembling that hadn't stopped. His head still throbbed where it had hit the table, a small lump forming on the back of his neck. He looked at the wall clock. 2:45 p.m. Only 15 minutes until Emma got out of school. If he didn't make it to the bus stop, she would have to wait alone at the school gate. The thought tied his stomach in a knot tighter than the pain from the impact. The door opened. It wasn't a director or a high-level manager. It was Mrs. Gable, a mid-level HR employee with black-framed glasses and a stack of files clutched in her hand. She didn't look Daniel in the eye, just pulled up a chair on the opposite side and placed a pre-printed paper on the table. "Daniel Reyes," she said, her voice as flat as if she were reading a menu. "We've reviewed the incident that just occurred in the conference room on the 40th floor. Is she okay?" Daniel leaned forward, the question slipping out instinctively. "I saw she was breathing again." Mrs. Gable held up a hand, cutting him off. She pushed a photo printed from a security camera toward him. It was a black and white, low-quality picture, tightly cropped. In the frame, Daniel was leaning over Isabella Cruz's face. From the camera's angle, it didn't look like CPR. It looked like a man forcibly kissing an unconscious woman. Daniel was speechless. "No, that's not what happened. I was giving her rescue breaths. She was in cardiac arrest." But according to the report from security and the witnesses present, your actions have been identified as inappropriate physical contact and a serious violation of the workplace code of conduct. "I saved her life." Daniel's voice cracked with indignation. "You're a janitor, Mr. Reyes. You do not have a company-authorized medical license to perform medical interventions on the executive board. The fact that you touched the CEO, tore her suit jacket, and—" she paused, a flicker of disgust flashing behind her glasses, "and put your mouth on hers, created a legal liability and serious damage to Cruz Holdings's image." She pushed the pre-printed paper toward him. It was a termination notice, effective immediately. Sign here to confirm you've received the notice. We'll pay you through the end of today, plus 2 weeks of severance. That's as generous as it gets." Daniel stared at the paper. The words danced before his eyes. Fired. Ethical violation. What if I don't sign? Then you'll lose the 2 weeks of pay, and we'll list the reason for termination on your record as sexual harassment instead of procedural violation. With that on your record, where do you think you'll find another job in this city? The room fell silent. Only the hum of the paper shredder remained, a machine waiting to shred the truth. Daniel thought of the electric bill in his pocket. He thought of Emma's sneakers, her toes crammed inside. He thought of the empty refrigerator at home. He picked up the pen. The calloused hand of a laborer trembled as he scrawled his name on the line at the bottom. He was selling his dignity for 2 weeks of survival for his daughter. Employee ID and access card. "Mrs." Gable said, holding out her hand. Daniel took the plastic card from around his neck and placed it in her palm. It felt weightless. He stood up, feeling as if he'd been stripped naked in the middle of winter. 15 minutes later, Daniel walked out the back door of the building. A light rain had started to fall. The cold wind cut through his thin jacket, chilling him to the bone. He stood on the curb, looking up at the gleaming glass skyscraper. Up there, they were cleaning up the mess, probably congratulating each other that the CEO had survived. Down here, the man who saved her had just been thrown to the curb like a used-up bag of trash. He pulled his collar up and walked quickly toward the bus stop. He was 5 minutes late to pick up Emma. The number 42 bus arrived with a screech of its brakes. Daniel squeezed on, swiping his transit card. The balance read, $8.50, enough for 3 more days. He found an empty seat at the back and leaned his head against the rattling window. The city blurred past in the rain. The shops, the restaurants, the hurried pedestrians, they all seemed to have their place in this machine. He was the only one who had just been thrown out. Daniel closed his eyes. The image of Isabella's chest, rising under his hands, came back to him. He knew he had done the right thing. The feeling of her ribs yielding under his compressions, the ragged breath from her throat that was real. No camera, no HR report could change the fact that he had pulled her back from death. But the truth doesn't pay the rent. When he got back to the old apartment complex in the suburbs, Daniel took a deep breath to calm himself before opening the door. He ran a hand through his messy hair, trying to wipe the exhaustion from his face. Click. The peeling wooden door opened. The warm, familiar smell of canned tomato soup wafted out. "Dad!" Emma, 7 years old, was drawing at the kitchen table. She looked up. She had her mother's big, round eyes. Seeing Daniel, she jumped off her chair and ran to hug his legs. "How come you're home so early? You were late picking me up? I thought you had to work overtime again." Daniel froze for a second. He bent down and scooped his daughter up into his arms. She was so light, lighter than a growing child should be. Well, Daniel swallowed the lump in his throat and forced a crooked smile. Dad took a few days off. The company let the best employees take a little vacation." "Really?" Emma's eyes lit up. "Does that mean you can take me to the park tomorrow? The one with the red swings?" Daniel's heart felt like it was being squeezed. He put her down and ruffled her hair. "Of course. We'll go tomorrow. Now, let's see what my little girl is drawing." He walked into the kitchen and opened the fridge. The dim yellow light shone on a few old food containers and a carton of milk that was only a quarter full. He stood there, the cold air hitting his face, trying to hide the tear that was about to fall. He had lost his job. His savings were 0. And tomorrow he would have to play the part of a happy father on vacation while having no idea where he and his daughter would be sleeping next month. "Dad, the soup is boiling!" Emma called out. Daniel quickly wiped his eyes and closed the refrigerator door. "Coming," he answered, his voice trying its best to sound normal. Dinner was like any other night. The two of them sat across from each other at the small, wobbly table. Emma excitedly talked about school, about how her teacher had praised her drawing of their family. Daniel listened, nodded, smiled at the right moments, and gave her the crispiest piece of toast. But under the table, his hand was clenched so tightly his nails dug into his palm. A storm was starting to brew outside the window, and an even bigger one was raging inside the man who had just been stripped of his right to be a good person. That night, after tucking Emma into bed, Daniel sat alone in the dark living room, listening to the rain tap against the window and the distant wail of a police siren. He stared into the void, wondering if, up in that ivory tower, the woman named Isabella remembered the face of the man who had saved her. Probably not. To them, he was just an invisible ghost. And now, that ghost was sinking into darkness. 2 weeks had passed since the incident in the conference room. Outside the 2-inch thick plate glass of the 40th floor, a heavy night rain was pouring down on New York City. The city lights below blurred, looking like meaningless splotches of color. Isabella Cruz leaned her forehead against the cold glass. She raised a hand to her left chest, where a dull ache still flared up every time she took a deep breath. The doctors at Mount Sinai called her survival a medical miracle, explaining that her chest was bruised from a precise external force that had kept her blood circulating. But Isabella knew it wasn't a miracle. It was sweat. It was the breath of cheap coffee. It was the desperation of one human being fighting for another's life. Every night, when the sedatives wore off, she would jolt awake to a sound echoing in her head. Not the beeping of machines in the ICU, but a hoarse male voice, broken with fear. "Breathe, please. Miss Cruz?" The voice pulled Isabella back to reality. Victor Hale, the CFO, was sitting at the small meeting table in her private office, swiping through his tablet. He looked as impeccable as ever, his Windsor knot perfect, showing no sign of having just gone through a leadership crisis. "We need to approve the final press release about your health incident," Victor said, without looking up. "The stock has stabilized. We've guided the narrative that the internal medical team responded promptly." Isabella walked slowly to her desk. She poured a glass of water, her hand trembling slightly. The pain in her chest was a reminder that the truth was not what was written in the report. "Victor," she said, her voice low but clear. "The man who saved me. Where is he?" Victor's finger paused on the screen for a split second, then resumed swiping. "That's been handled. You don't need to worry about it." "Handled?" Isabella frowned. "I want to see him. I want to thank him." Victor sighed and took off his glasses, a gesture he always made when he had to explain something complicated to a clueless child. "Isabella, listen. He was a temp janitor. He committed a serious safety violation. He had no medical certification but decided to perform a procedure on the CEO. Legal and HR assessed it as a potential litigation risk. We can't encourage low-level employees to be touching the executive board." "So where is he?" Isabella's voice hardened as she slammed the glass down on the table. "Terminated. That same afternoon." The air in the room seemed to freeze. The sound of the rain hitting the glass was suddenly loud. "Terminated?" she repeated, a chill running down her spine. "You fired the man who kept my heart beating?" "We were protecting your reputation," Victor said, standing up, his voice firmer. "The camera recorded him, engaging in inappropriate behavior while you were unconscious. He leaned down and kissed you, Isabella. We did what was necessary to quash any harassment rumors." Isabella stared at Victor. In her mind, the faint memory of a warm breath filling her lungs began to piece itself together. "Julia," she called through the intercom, "get in here now." Her young assistant entered immediately, tablet in hand, a worried expression on her face as she took in the tense atmosphere. "Show me the video footage from that day," Isabella ordered. "The original, unedited." "Isabella, you haven't fully recovered. Don't upset yourself." Victor tried to intervene, stepping forward to block her view. "Now, Julia!" Isabella shouted. For the first time in 2 weeks, the authority of the head of the corporation was back in her voice. Julia quickly connected the tablet to the large screen on the wall. The video appeared. It was a high-angle, black-and-white shot with no audio. Isabella held her breath. She saw herself collapse. She saw the crowd of men in expensive suits, the men she called her colleagues, back away, as if she were a plague. She saw Victor, the man standing right there, pull out his phone to record instead of help. And then, a figure in a gray uniform rushed in. Isabella stepped closer to the screen. The man threw his mop, shoved the guard. He knelt down, his hands interlocked. The chest compressions were strong, decisive. She saw him lean down to give a breath. "Stop," Isabella said. The image froze. On the screen, the man's face was clear in low resolution. His hair was matted with sweat. His jaw was clenched with effort. His eyes weren't looking at her chest with the lecherous gaze Victor had implied. He was staring at her face, the look of a man betting his own life to win back someone else's. That wasn't harassment. That was a fight with death itself. The video continued. She saw the guards pull him away. She saw him fall, his head hitting the table, being dragged away like a sack of trash right as she opened her eyes. Isabella turned away from the screen, her chest aching not from the physical injury, but from an invisible punch from her conscience. She had spent her entire life building power so no one could hurt her. Yet that very power system had just crushed her savior. "What's his name?" she asked, her voice quiet, but terrifying. Julia swiped quickly through the personnel file, her fingers trembling. Daniel Reyes. Janitorial staff for the engineering floor. Employed for 3 years. Performance review? Excellent. Circumstances: single father, 1 7-year-old daughter. Current status: terminated. Health insurance cut, HR reported. He was blacklisted from building service companies for an ethical violation. The room was dead silent. Only the hum of the TV screen's cooling fan could be heard. Isabella closed her eyes. She remembered the warmth of that rough hand on her chest. This man had saved her. Only for her, or her giant shadow, to stomp him into the mud the moment he stood up. She opened her eyes and looked directly at Victor. "You said you were protecting my reputation?" Isabella stepped forward until they were only a foot apart. "You just turned me into the most ungrateful monster in this city." She turned to Julia, not waiting for Victor's rebuttal. "Get the car ready. Now." "Now? It's 8 p.m., and there's a storm." Julia hesitated, glancing at the dark window. "I don't care if it's a storm or a flood," Isabella said, grabbing her trench coat from the rack. She didn't look in the mirror, didn't fix her hair. She was no longer a CEO on her way to a press conference. She was a debtor going to find her creditor. And Victor, she paused at the door, her hand gripping the gold-plated handle so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Don't even think about deleting any more data. I want a full report from the HR department on my desk tomorrow morning." Isabella strode to the private elevator. The floor numbers descended rapidly. 40, 30, 20. Each floor passing by was a layer of society she had long forgotten. She walked out into the building's lobby, where the shiny black car was waiting. The driver rushed to hold an umbrella for her, but Isabella waved him away. She let the cold raindrops hit her face, soaking her silk blouse. The cold helped her think clearly. It reminded her that she was alive, and that out there, in this rain, was a man and his little girl who might be slowly dying because of his own kindness. "To the Bronx," she said, as she got into the back seat, her voice firm. "I'll give you the specific directions from the GPS." The car sped off into the night, leaving the brightly lit tower behind. This time, power wasn't sitting on its throne. Power was going down to the streets to find the humanity it had lost. The sleek black car pulled up in front of an old, red brick apartment building on the southern edge of the Bronx. Here, the yellow streetlights flickered intermittently, and black trash bags piled on the curb gave off a musty smell mixed with rainwater. Isabella got out of the car. The heel of her designer shoe sank into a puddle on the cracked sidewalk, but she didn't bother to look down. She looked up at the dark row of windows on the building before her. Apartment 4B. "Miss Cruz, this area isn't safe," the driver called out hesitantly, his hand still on the car door. "Wait here," Isabella commanded curtly, then walked quickly into the narrow entrance that led to the stairwell. The building's hallway reeked of old food and cheap cigarettes. There was no elevator. Isabella climbed 4 flights of stairs, her breathing growing heavy, the lingering pain in her chest reminding her of her physical limits. But every step she took on the concrete was resolute. On the 4th floor, she stopped. The wooden door of apartment 4B wasn't shut tight but slightly ajar, revealing a dark sliver of space, a clear sign that the resident had lost control of their own safety. Isabella gently pushed the door open. Just inside, illuminated by the dim yellow light from the kitchen, a small girl was curled up on the cold floor. She was wearing an oversized sweater with frayed elbows, clutching a cloth doll with one eye falling off, and staring intently into the dark living room. It was his daughter, Emma. Hearing the noise, Emma jumped and looked up. The girl's big, round eyes were red and swollen, filled with the raw terror of a cornered animal. Isabella slowly knelt down to meet the girl's gaze. "Hello?" Her voice trembled slightly, trying to be as gentle as possible. "I'm a friend of your dad's. Where is Daniel?" Emma stared at her, her small lips pressed tightly together, then pointed a trembling finger toward the darkness behind her. "Daddy. Daddy's been sleeping since this morning. He won't wake up." Isabella's heart seized. She shot to her feet and rushed inside. A wave of cold air washed over the room. The heat wasn't on. On the tiny dining table against the wall was a stack of unpaid bills and an opened, cold can of soup. "Daniel?" Isabella called out. No answer. Just the sound of the wind whistling softly through a window sealed with duct tape. She saw him on the old sofa in the corner of the living room. He was still in yesterday's clothes, curled into a ball, shivering violently under a thin blanket. Isabella rushed to his side. "Daniel!" She touched his forehead. It was burning hot. A cold sweat soaked his temples, matting his dark hair to his skin. His breathing was shallow and ragged, like lungs struggling to filter every bit of air. The dark purple bruise on the back of his neck, from where he hit the table in the conference room, had turned a terrifying blackish gray. Infection, exhaustion, and the cold of poverty was eating him alive. Isabella fumbled for her phone. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to tap the emergency call button twice. 911. "I need an ambulance immediately," she said, her voice sharp, trying to control the rising panic. "Male victim, around 35, high fever, delirious, has a head injury. Hurry." She hung up, tossing the phone onto the couch cushion. Isabella grabbed Daniel's calloused, rough hand, the hand that had pressed on her chest 2 weeks ago. Then it had been warm and strong. Now it was cold and limp. "Please, don't go," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Emma needs you." Daniel stirred. His eyes fluttered open, drowsy and clouded. He saw a blurry figure in front of him, his lips moving weakly. "Emma, get Emma. Emma's fine. She's right here, Isabella said quickly, using her other hand to wipe the sweat from his forehead. Just lie still. The ambulance is coming. Just then, the wail of a siren rose from the street below, tearing through the quiet night of the poor neighborhood. Emma tiptoed closer, still clutching her doll. She stood, huddled by the sofa, looking at her father with frightened eyes. Isabella turned and pulled the little girl close. One of her hands held the dying father's, the other rested on the small daughter's shoulder. 3 minutes later, 2 paramedics burst into the room with a stretcher and a medical bag. The tiny apartment was suddenly chaotic with the crackle of radios and short, clipped medical commands. Weak pulse. Fever, 104. Signs of acute pneumonia. One paramedic shouted as he ripped open Daniel's shirt to attach electrodes. They lifted Daniel onto the stretcher. Isabella stood up, holding Emma's hand tightly as she followed them out. "Are you family?" a paramedic asked quickly as they rushed the stretcher down the narrow stairs. Isabella looked at Daniel, motionless on the stretcher, then down at Emma, trembling by her side. "I'm responsible for him," she answered firmly. The ambulance sped through the rainy night, its siren echoing off the brick walls. Inside the cramped compartment, thick with the smell of disinfectant, Daniel lay with an oxygen mask covering half his face. The green lines on the heart monitor danced weakly. Isabella sat on the bench beside him, with Emma on her lap. The little girl had stopped crying and just buried her face in Isabella's expensive coat. Isabella looked through the rear window. New York City receded behind them in a blur of rain. The glittering skyscrapers in the distance looked alien. Tonight, she wasn't returning to her ivory tower. She was heading into another battle, the fight to save the life of the man her world had thrown away. Daniel's hand twitched slightly on the stretcher. Isabella quickly reached out and took it again. This time, she didn't let go. 9 in the morning. The 42nd floor strategy room was cold. Even though the central heating was humming, the smell of stale machine coffee and fresh printer paper hung in the air. 12 board members sat around the 20-foot-long oval table. Victor Hale stood at the head of the table, a laser pointer in his hand, indicating a rising chart on the projector screen. "The media crisis has been contained," Victor said, his voice smooth and confident. "We've guided the narrative that the CEO's health incident was merely minor exhaustion. Cruise Holdings stock is back up 2% this morning. As for the janitor involved, legal has settled the non-disclosure agreement. He won't dare open his mouth." A few nods of approval went around the table. The rustle of paper. Click. The double mahogany doors swung open. Isabella Cruz walked in. She wasn't wearing her usual gray suit. Today, she wore a long, black, high-collared coat. Her face was not heavily made up, but it radiated a sharp coldness. Julia followed right behind her, clutching a silver laptop. The entire room fell silent. Victor lowered his hand, the smile on his face freezing. "Isabella," Victor said, trying to remain calm, "you should be resting." The doctor said, "Sit down, Victor." Isabella cut him off. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was heavy enough to make Victor pause and slowly sink back into his chair. Isabella walked directly to the head of the table, the seat next to which she had collapsed 2 weeks prior. She didn't sit. She placed her hands on the polished wooden surface, her eyes sweeping over every face in the room. These men had worked with her for 10 years. Cut ribbons at building openings with her, raised champagne glasses to year-end profits with her. "Who?" she asked, her tone clipped. No one answered. The whirring of the projector fan was suddenly deafening. "I asked," she repeated, emphasizing each word. "Who signed Daniel Reyes's termination order that afternoon while I was still in the emergency room?" Victor adjusted his tie. He cleared his throat. "It was an automatic procedure, Isabella. HR and security activated the risk protocol. He was a temp employee who engaged in unauthorized physical contact. We had to eliminate the risk of a sexual harassment lawsuit. Sexual harassment? Isabella let out a dry laugh, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. You call saving a human life a legal risk? We have to protect the corporation's image, a board member spoke up, defending Victor. The extracted video clip showed his actions were very inappropriate. Isabella gave a slight nod to Julia. Julia placed the laptop on the table and connected a cable to the projection system. The stock chart on the screen vanished. In its place was the black and white security camera footage. But this time, it wasn't the cropped clip Victor had used. This was the raw footage. With audio, the entire room held its breath. On the screen, Daniel's shout echoed, "Call 911. Now!" The faint crack of ribs, as he did compressions, the sound of his ragged breathing, and clearest of all, the disgusted whispers from the crowd and Victor's order to record. Then came the scene of Daniel being dragged away, the scene of him being thrown into the trash elevator. The video ended. The screen went black. Isabella looked directly at Victor. He sustained serious injuries being dragged out of this room, all for trying to keep this heart beating. Isabella said, her voice trembling with suppressed emotion, as her hand instinctively went to her left chest. While he was in pain saving me, you all stood and watched. And then, you threw my savior out on the street like a bag of trash, stripping him of his health insurance right when he needed it most to treat the injuries caused by the callousness of this very place. We followed the handbook. Victor slammed his hand on the table and shot to his feet. His face was beet red. You're letting emotions interfere with business. If you admit to a failure in our security protocol, the stock will plummet. You are destroying the very empire you built. No, Victor, Isabella replied, her voice frighteningly calm. I'm saving it. She pulled a thin file from her coat pocket and tossed it on the table. It slid across the surface and stopped right in front of Victor. What's this? Victor frowned. The decision to restructure the HR and security departments and an order for the immediate reinstatement of Daniel Reyes, along with a public apology from Cruz Holdings. You're insane, Victor hissed. The board will never approve this. The press will tear us apart. Isabella stepped closer to Victor. She was a head shorter than him, but her overwhelming presence made him take half a step back. 2 days ago, I was in an ambulance, she said quietly, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. I saw what lies beyond the glass walls of this ivory tower. Daniel Reyes and his daughter taught me a lesson no business school can. A company without humanity doesn't deserve to exist. She turned back to the room. From today on, our procedures will be redefined. Anyone who disagrees can submit their resignation by 5 p.m. With that, Isabella turned and walked out the door. The sound of her heels on the wooden floor was firm, without a trace of hesitation. Victor stood there, frozen, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. The silence in the room was no longer one of agreement, but of fear in the face of a new storm. Julia quickly unplugged the cable, grabbed the laptop, and hurried after Isabella. Once in the hallway, Isabella didn't stop. She walked straight to the elevator. Miss Cruz, Julia whispered, as the elevator doors closed, blocking the view of curious employees peering out. Reporters are waiting in the lobby. Victor called them before the meeting to announce the business results. What are you going to do now? Isabella looked at her reflection in the elevator's metal wall. Her eyes had dark circles from 2 sleepless nights at the hospital, but the fire in her gaze had returned. They want a story? Isabella adjusted her coat collar. I'll give them the truth. The elevator dinged for the ground floor. The doors opened. A storm of camera flashes went off like a chaotic meteor shower. Isabella stepped out, head held high, ready for the real battle outside the soundproof walls. Flashes from hundreds of cameras went off non-stop. Daniel Reyes stood behind a thick velvet curtain in the wings, loosening the striped blue tie he wasn't used to wearing. 2 months ago, he had been dragged out of this building through the back door for trash, with serious injuries and his dignity trampled. Today, they rolled out the red carpet and invited him in through the main entrance. Beyond the curtain, the noise from the crowd of reporters and employees quieted as Isabella Cruz stepped up to the podium. Daniel peeked through the curtain. Isabella wasn't wearing a powerful black suit today. She wore a simple cream-colored dress, her hair down naturally. She didn't look at the prepared speech. She looked directly into the live camera broadcasting. "We often pride ourselves on the height of this tower," Isabella's voice echoed, deep and warm through the surround sound system. "But we have forgotten its foundation. 2 months ago, I owed my life to a man our company's protocol called a risk. Today, I stand here to correct that definition." She turned her head toward the wings, her eyes searching. "Please welcome Mr. Daniel Reyes." Daniel took a deep breath. He stepped into the light. Applause broke out, at first scattered, then roaring like a downpour. He squinted, trying to walk steadily, even though his heart was pounding just as hard as it had the day he performed CPR on her. Isabella walked over to him. In her hands was a velvet tray, holding a new employee ID and a file. "Daniel," she said. Without the microphone, her voice just for the two of them. "The board has approved it. The position of regional custodial supervisor is yours. Triple the salary, a private office, and you'll never have to hold a mop again." Daniel looked at the gold-rimmed employee ID. He looked down at his own hands. The calluses were still there. He was silent for a moment, then shook his head slightly. "Thank you, Isabella." "Really?" Daniel smiled, a gentle and relieved smile. "But I don't want an office job. I want my old uniform and my mop back. I'm most comfortable cleaning things with my own 2 hands, not pointing at others to do it." Isabella was stunned. She looked deep into his eyes, searching for pride or resentment, but saw only peace. "Are you sure? Positive?" Daniel nodded. "Just don't dock my pay if I leave early to pick up Emma." Isabella laughed. A tear rolled quickly down her cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. She turned to the crowd, holding up a blue file. "Mr. Reyes has declined the special privilege," she announced loudly. "Therefore, in place of a management position, Cruz Holdings is proud to announce the Invisible Workforce Protection Program. From now on, all contract employees, from security to janitorial staff, will receive full health insurance and an emergency support fund. We will not let anyone be left behind." The entire hall erupted. The catering staff, carrying trays of water in the back, stopped and stared at each other in disbelief. Just then, a small figure in a yellow floral dress darted onto the stage, despite the gentle attempts of security to stop her. "Daddy!" Emma ran and threw her arms around Daniel's legs. He bent down and scooped his daughter up with one arm. She wasn't afraid of the crowd. She held out a slightly crumpled crayon, drawing toward Isabella. "This is for you," Emma said with a toothy grin, her voice ringing out through the hall. "Daddy said you're a queen in a high tower, but I drew you standing on the ground." The little girl pointed a tiny finger at the scribbled picture. "Because my teacher says you have to stand on the ground to hold hands." In the drawing, 2 misshapen stick figures stood next to each other on a green line. There were no crowns, no halos, just 2 hands, one big, one small, colored over each other tightly with a bright red crayon. Isabella froze. She slowly knelt down right in the middle of the stage, in front of hundreds of cameras to be at eye level with the child. She took the drawing with both hands, as carefully as if she were holding a living thing. Her fingers touched the warm, waxy texture of the crayon. She said nothing. just pressed the drawing to her left chest, where her heart had once stopped and was now beating with a revived rhythm. It was the most valuable contract she had ever signed. The ceremony ended with soft music. While reporters surrounded Isabella to ask about the new policy, Daniel quietly led Emma by the hand down the main stairs, away from the noise. The father and daughter walked out the revolving door into the cool New York evening air. "Daddy? Are we famous?" Emma asked, swinging her hand in her father's. "No, sweetie," Daniel said, adjusting his daughter's collar as he watched the bustling crowds on the sidewalk. "We're just not invisible anymore." He looked back one last time at the brightly lit tower behind them, then turned away. Daniel Reyes, the janitor who refused to be a manager, led his daughter into the flow of the city. Small but steady, walking among the countless lights that were just beginning to turn on. "Excellent. The manuscript you've provided has a very strong and symbolic framework. The TV van, the newspaper, the late-night text. To turn this into a compelling 90-minute audio script, I'll breathe more detail into the actions, thicken the atmosphere and pacing, but still preserve the core and dialogue you've supplied." 2 weeks after the ceremony, the peace Daniel had hoped for never came. Instead, his life became loud and exhausting in a completely different way. Swoosh! Daniel yanked the window curtain shut, blocking out the daylight. He peeked through a small gap. Down on the street, the white van, with the satellite antenna from the local TV station, was still stubbornly parked right in front of his apartment building. The camera lens was pointed straight at his balcony like the barrel of a gun. He turned back to the dining table. His cheap cell phone was vibrating violently on the wooden surface, inching its way toward the edge. The screen lit up constantly. Unknown number. People magazine, daily news. 15 missed calls in just 1 hour. They didn't want the truth. They wanted to interview the mop-wielding hero. Or more cynically, they were hunting for evidence to see if this was all a PR stunt orchestrated by the Cruise Corporation. The sound of small, shuffling footsteps on the wooden floor interrupted his thoughts. "Daddy!" Emma came out of her bedroom. She wasn't hugging her familiar cloth doll today. Her hand was gripping the strap of her school backpack, but her feet were rooted to the spot. Her big round eyes were red and swollen. "I don't want to go to school." Daniel sighed, putting his phone down. He walked over and squatted down to be at her eye level. He straightened the slightly wrinkled collar of her school uniform. "What's wrong, sweetie? You have art class today, right?" Emma looked down, scuffing the toe of her shoe on the floor. Tommy said, "You're a liar." Her voice choked, barely a whisper. "He said you were acting to get money from that rich lady. He said real heroes can fly. They don't clean floors." Daniel froze. A bitter taste filled his throat, as if he'd just swallowed a pill without water. Legal vindication couldn't stop gossip from seeping into a children's playground. He pulled Emma into his arms and held her tight. He breathed in the smell of her baby shampoo to calm himself, to stop the anger from boiling over. "Tommy is wrong," Daniel whispered into her ear, his voice firm. "It doesn't matter what other people say. I know the truth. You know the truth. And we know that tonight, I'm still coming home to make soup for you. That's enough. Right?" Emma sniffled, then nodded gently against his shoulder. Daniel stood up and led her out the back door to avoid the cameras. At the same time, 40 floors up, in the strategy room of Cruise Holdings, Isabella was fighting a different battle. Slap! A tabloid newspaper was thrown hard onto the polished mahogany table. It slid across the surface and stopped next to Isabella's coffee cup. The headline was bold, black, and jarring. "Kidness or marketing strategy. The stock is fluctuating," Isabella, an elderly shareholder with a full head of white hair, said, tapping his fingers impatiently on the table. The gold of his ring clinked against the wood. You're turning this corporation into a charity. We're in the real estate business, Miss Cruz, not the ethics business." The room was dead silent. All eyes were on the woman at the head of the table. Isabella didn't flinch. She slowly lifted her coffee cup. It was black, unsweetened, and had long gone cold. She took a sip, the bitter taste spreading through her mouth. Helping her focus, she set the cup down. The sound of porcelain on wood was soft but decisive. She looked the old shareholder directly in the eye. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice calm but as sharp as a scalpel. "Ethics is the only thing that kept this brand from collapsing after the scandal of abandoning a CEO's rescuer 2 weeks ago." She pushed the newspaper away like a piece of trash. "I'm not selling kindness. I'm buying back trust. And believe me, that price is a lot cheaper than this corporation getting boycotted." The meeting ended in a tense silence. Isabella sat alone, looking out the large window. The city below sparkled, but from this height she felt colder than ever. Late that night, only when Emma was fast asleep, her steady breathing coming from the other room, did Daniel dare to step out onto the small, narrow balcony. The October night wind whistled through the rusty iron bars, chilling him. He shivered and pulled his jacket collar up. Below, the last TV van had finally left, returning a temporary quiet to the poor street. Beep! The phone in his pocket vibrated once. Daniel took it out. The blue light of the screen illuminated his tired face. A text from an unknown number. But from the tone, he knew exactly who it was. "It doesn't matter what they say. What matters is that you and Emma are safe tonight. Sleep well. I.C." Daniel read the short message over and over. His thumb hovered over the screen, about to type a reply. But then he stopped. He turned off the screen and put the phone back in his pocket. He looked up toward the city center, where the skyscrapers were still lit up day and night. There was an invisible connection between this rundown apartment and that luxurious office. A connection between two people trying to stay decent in a world full of schemes. The legal battle was over, but the fight for peace had just begun. Daniel went back inside. He gently closed the glass balcony door, shutting out the cold wind to keep his daughter's sleep warm. Tonight, at least for tonight, they were okay. A month passed since that late-night text, and the last of the TV vans finally left Daniel's street. Quiet returned, but it wasn't the oppressive silence of poverty. It was the stillness of a choice made. Monday morning, in the engineering basement of the Cruz building. Clank. The sound of a metal locker door shutting echoed decisively. Daniel Reyes smoothed out the wrinkles on his brand-new dark blue uniform. The Cruz Holdings logo on his chest was embroidered with gold thread, the mark of an official staff member in the Invisible Workforce Protection Program. Marcus, his old colleague who had worked there for 20 years, leaned against the lockers, shaking his head as he watched Daniel pull on his safety boots. "I still don't get it, Daniel," Marcus said, his voice gruff. "Boss Isabella offered you a seat in an air-conditioned office. 80 grand a year. You turned it down to come down here and smell bleach? You're crazy." Daniel smiled, tying his laces tightly. "It's too cold up there, Marcus," he replied, his voice light. "Besides, I like to see the results of my work right away. One wipe, and it's clean. Paperwork isn't that simple." He clapped Marcus on the shoulder and pushed his janitorial cart out into the hallway. The wheels rolled smoothly on the floor, no longer making the screeching sound of his old, beat-up cart. Daniel started his shift in the third-floor auxiliary lobby, an area with less foot traffic but lots of glass. He dipped his mop into a bucket of water mixed with a pine-scented solution, wrung it out just enough, and began making long, even strokes. Left, right. Left, right. This familiar rhythm soothed his mind more than any praise in the newspapers. No one looked at him like a stranger anymore. No one whispered. He was a part of the building again, but this time he stood tall. Employees walking by nodded at him. "Good morning, Mr. Reyes." There was respect in their eyes, not because he was a hero, but because he was a colleague. During his lunch break, Daniel sat on a wooden bench in the small garden behind the building, a place for employees to relax. He opened the container with the ham sandwich he'd made that morning, the sound of gravel crunching. Daniel looked up. Isabella Cruz was standing there. She wasn't wearing a suit or high heels today. She wore a beige turtleneck sweater, jeans, and white sneakers. She looked younger than her age, and for the first time, she didn't look like she was carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. "Is this spot taken?" Isabella asked, holding 2 paper coffee cups. Daniel quickly wiped his hands on his pants and scooted over. "Always available, Miss Cruz." Isabella sat down and handed him a cup. The steam rising from it smelled wonderful. "Just call me Isabella," she said, looking out at the neatly trimmed lawn. "You know, Daniel, yesterday I wondered if I made a mistake letting you come back to this job. I felt like I was wasting a talent." Daniel held the coffee cup, feeling the warmth spread through the paper. He looked down at his calloused hands, then looked her straight in the eye. "Isabella?" "Look," he said, pointing toward the glass lobby doors he had just finished cleaning, which were sparkling in the sunlight, spotless. "That's what I do best. If I were a manager, I'd just sit around worrying if other people were doing a good job. But here, I know for a fact that I did a good job. For me, that's enough." Isabella was quiet for a long moment. Then she smiled. It was the most relaxed smile Daniel had ever seen on her face. "You're right. Sometimes simplicity is the greatest luxury." Suddenly, a clear voice called out from the side gate. "Daddy!" Emma, with her oversized backpack, ran into the garden. Her school was just 2 blocks away, and the new habit for the father and daughter was to have lunch together. Seeing Isabella, Emma stopped for a second, then broke into a wide grin. She was no longer scared or shy like she had been on that rainy night. "Miss Light-Up Queen!" Emma exclaimed. "Hi, Emma!" Isabella waved. "I'm not being a queen today. I just came to ask for a bite of a sandwich." Emma ran over and squeezed in between the 2 adults. She opened her lunchbox, took out half of a slightly squished sandwich, and generously offered it to Isabella. "Here you go. My dad makes the best. Just a little light on the mayonnaise." Daniel laughed and ruffled his daughter's hair. Isabella took the piece of bread and, without hesitation, took a hearty bite. The 3 of them sat there on the wooden bench, under the gentle afternoon sun. There were no cameras, no halos, no gap between rich and poor, just the sound of a child's laughter and the rich smell of coffee. Daniel watched Emma happily chattering away, and then looked at Isabella, who was listening intently. He realized that his life had truly healed, not because he was vindicated, but because he had found his sense of normalcy again, that precious feeling he once feared he had lost forever. That afternoon, as he walked Emma home, it read, "This area is cared for by the Invisible Workforce Protection Team." Daniel gently squeezed his daughter's hand. The seed he had planted in the storm was now beginning to quietly sprout. 2 months after Daniel returned to work, the atmosphere in the city seemed to have changed. Not in the bright neon signs, but in the overlooked corners. On a Wednesday morning, Daniel was cleaning the lobby of the building across the street. A new branch that had just signed on to implement the Invisible Workforce Protection model. The steady hum of the floor polisher blended with the hurried rhythm of city life. "Excuse me, sir, are you Daniel Reyes?" Daniel looked up. A group of 3 college students, holding notebooks and a recorder, stood shyly in front of him. They were wearing hoodies with the NYU logo. Daniel turned off the machine and wiped the sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. That's me! What can I do for you kids? We're doing a sociology paper on everyday heroes, the student with glasses said excitedly. Could we ask you one question? What does it feel like to be a hero? Daniel smiled, a gentle smile that revealed the lines around his eyes. He shook his head slightly, his hand still on the handle of the polisher. You've got the wrong guy. I'm no hero. Heroes fly around, saving the world. I'm just a man who saw someone stop breathing and helped them breathe again. He pointed to the other janitors working nearby. If you want to write about heroes, write about them. The people who wake up at 4 a.m. so this city is clean when the sun rises. The students looked at each other, then began scribbling in their notes. His answer wasn't glamorous, but it was more real than any theory in their textbooks. At the same time, during recess at the elementary school, Mrs. Miller clapped her hands to get the attention of the noisy children. Today is free story time. Does anyone want to share? Emma's hand shot up the highest. She walked to the front of the class, twisting her hands nervously, but her eyes were shining. I want to talk about my dad, Emma said, her voice clear. People say janitors are invisible. But my dad says no one is invisible. People just forget how to look. And now, at Miss Isabella's company, the security guard knows the cleaning lady's name, and the driver smiles at the mailman. My dad turned on a light switch. And now, everyone is bright. The class was completely silent. Mrs. Miller discreetly wiped a tear from the corner of her eye. She saw the seeds of compassion sprouting in the souls of these children, pure and strong. On the 42nd floor, in the CEO's office, Isabella stood by the window, but she wasn't looking down at the street. She was reading a handwritten letter on cheap, lined paper. The handwriting was shaky, the ink slightly smudged. Dear Miss Cruz, I'm a janitor at the Ohio branch. For 20 years, I've been afraid of getting fired every time I got sick. Yesterday, my manager told me I could take paid leave to see a doctor. My wife cried. Thank you. And thank that man named Daniel. I'm not afraid to do the right thing anymore. Isabella folded the letter and placed it respectfully on her glass desk, next to million-dollar contracts. She let out a soft, relieved breath. The change didn't come from slogans on a billboard. It came from the peaceful dinner of a working-class family thousands of miles away. She grabbed her coat and left the office earlier than usual. Isabella drove to the park renovation site on the west side, where Daniel was supervising the afternoon shift. The sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow over the steel frames and concrete. Daniel was standing there, holding a hard hat, watching the workers pack up to go home. He waved goodbye to each one, calling them by name. Isabella walked up, her sneakers crunching on the gravel. End of the shift. Daniel, she said softly. Daniel turned. The sunset illuminated his face with a strange peacefulness. Just a little bit of final cleanup, he replied, pointing to a neatly gathered pile of rubble. I want everything tidy for tomorrow. You've cleaned up enough for the whole world. Isabella smiled, standing beside him, both of them looking toward the horizon as it turned a deep purple. Neither of them said anything more. Amid the distant sound of car horns and the wind whistling through the scaffolding, they stood there, a CEO and a janitor, sharing a moment of silence. They knew the storm had truly passed, and what remained was a stronger foundation for everyone. Let's go home, Daniel said, after a long while. Emma's waiting. She wants me to finish her storybook tonight. Can I come with you? Isabella asked, as naturally as if she were asking an old friend. I brought some cocoa powder. Of course, but be careful on the stairs. The light on the third-floor landing still isn't fixed. Two long shadows stretched across the ground as they walked side by side, leaving the construction site to return to the simple things waiting for them behind a front door. The November drizzle tapped gently against the window pane, a steady, soothing rhythm, completely different from the screaming rain of that fateful night 2 months ago. In apartment 4B, Daniel sat on the edge of Emma's bed. The warm, yellow nightlight illuminated the worn spine of an old comic book. He read slowly, his index finger tracing the words for his daughter to follow. And then, the little bear realized that the best home wasn't a cave full of honey, but a place where friends were waiting at the door. Emma was dozing off, her long eyelashes fluttering, but her small hand still clutched her dad's pinky finger. The radiator in the corner hissed softly, warming the small but tidy space. Everything was so quiet. Knock, knock, knock. 3 soft, measured knocks came from the front door. Daniel gently slipped his finger from his daughter's grasp, pulled up her wool blanket, and tiptoed into the living room. He opened the door. Isabella stood there. She shook the small raindrops from the shoulders of her gray wool coat. In her hands wasn't a briefcase or a contract, but a brown paper bag from the corner store, and a thin file tucked under her arm. "Am I interrupting bedtime?" Isabella whispered. "Just in time," Daniel smiled, stepping back to let her in. Emma just drifted off. Isabella placed the paper bag on the kitchen counter. She took out a canister of cocoa powder and a small bag of marshmallows. "I owe you 2 a hot cocoa from the other day at the construction site," she said, naturally shrugging off her coat and hanging it on the back of a chair. She rolled up her sweater sleeves, revealing a slender wrist bare of any expensive watch. Daniel got some water and lit the gas stove. The blue flame flared to life. While the water heated, Isabella sat down in the familiar wobbly wooden chair. She placed the file on the table, but didn't open it. It was the draft for a project to expand the Employee Welfare Fund, but tonight it was just a decoration. 2 steaming, chipped ceramic mugs were placed on the table. Daniel sat down across from her. He watched the marshmallows melt into the dark brown cocoa. "You know," Daniel said, his voice low, his eyes on his mug, "it's been a long time since I haven't had to worry about how I'm going to wake up the next day. The feeling is strange." Isabella warmed her hands around her mug. "It's called peace, Daniel. You deserve it." The bedroom door creaked open. Emma emerged, rubbing her eyes, a drawing in her hand. She wasn't surprised to see Isabella, as if her presence here was the most natural thing in the world. "I forgot to give you this." Emma yawned, climbing onto Daniel's lap and placing the paper on the table. It was a drawing of 3 people sitting around a round table. No one was wearing a hero's cape. No one was holding a queen's scepter. Just 3 figures, with bright yellow dots, colored firmly in the middle of their chests. "What's this, sweetie?" Isabella asked, tilting her head. "People with light bulbs in their hearts," Emma mumbled, leaning her head on her dad's shoulder, her eyes closing. "My teacher said, anyone who is kind has a glowing heart, so no one gets lost in the dark anymore." Daniel and Isabella looked at each other. A gentle smile spread across both their faces. Without any fancy words, the childish drawing encapsulated everything they had been through. Daniel picked Emma up to carry her back to bed, then returned. He took a piece of tape and stuck the drawing on the old refrigerator door. The most place of honor in the house, covering up the now-paid bills. He stepped back to admire it. "Clean," Daniel said softly. A professional term for a janitor. But now it held a completely different meaning. All the stains of prejudice, of injustice, of doubt had been washed away. Isabella stood beside him, shoulder to shoulder. Outside the window, the rain was still falling, but the streetlight shining through the wet glass created sparkling spots of light that danced on the wooden floor. In the small kitchen, fragrant with the smell of hot cocoa, life didn't stop. It had just begun again in the most normal and decent way possible. As the lights in Daniel's small kitchen went out, the story closes with a simple truth. A person's dignity is not found on their business card or the floor they stand on, but in the depth of their heart. Daniel chose to go back to his mop instead of a manager's chair, reminding us that the greatest happiness is to live true to ourselves and to sleep soundly each night with a clean conscience. I know you might be silently shouldering the weight of your own life, just like him. Maybe no one applauded your efforts today, but please, never think you are invisible. The small things you do for your family and those around you are what keep this world warm. I hope that after a long, hard day, you find a peace of your own. You've done great. Now get some rest. Thank you for listening.